Istanbul is easily the most colorful city I've ever visited. There seemed to be no end to its jaw-dropping architecture, rich culture, exotic food, wonderful shopping, fascinating wildlife. I mean me, not the pigeons.
In case you're wondering, I do feel as stupid as I look.
And a captivating history that lives and breathes to this very day.
Yeah. I know, look at the funny American.
But before I left, I had one more stop to make in Istanbul, the Hagia Sophia. This is the big-ticket item, one of Turkey's most visited sites, and the one you'll probably see on the cover of most Turkish tourist books. It's a cathedral turned mosque turned museum. It has a long history of surviving numerous invasions and several severe earthquakes, but it's still standing and still attracting millions of visitors. Oh, and by the way, if the Hagia Sophia looks familiar, it might be because it's been featured in no fewer than 4 modern-day video games, and it inspired the buildings of Naboo in the movie Star Wars Episode 1.
If there's any building in modern-day Istanbul that represents the fascinating history of this city, it's got to be this one. In English, it's called Holy Wisdom. In Turkey, they call it Hagia Sophia.
The Hagia Sophia is huge. It's the kind of colossal building you walk into and get dizzy just looking up.
This is amazing.
Or maybe that was the Turkish delight. It's hard to say.
The Hagia Sophia, dwarfing most cathedrals in all of Europe, many of which took hundreds of years to build. This one, 5 years, 10 months, 4 days, and 32 seconds.
The Hagia Sophia that exists today is an architectural marvel. The main structure is more than 265 feet long and 228 feet wide, and it carries a dome that is 185 feet high and 103 feet wide. And it's supported by no fewer than 107 columns. It also contains at least 12 different varieties of marble, incredible amounts of gold leaf, and priceless ancient mosaics that spent most of their history hidden by plaster. And though it's actually the 3rd colossal structure to be built on this site, the building I'm standing in today dates all the way back to the 6th century, more than 1,400 years.
Now I'm standing on the edge of the balcony overlooking this gigantic central portion of the Hagia Sophia. Now it was really a Christian cathedral at one time, dedicated in 537 AD. Now there were 2 Hagia Sophias before that, one of which was dedicated in 360, and there was one also in between. Those first 2 Hagia Sophias were destroyed and burnt down by various uprisings and revolts.
The first cathedral was built by the son of Constantine the Great, named Constantius I. And as we all know, sequels are never as good as the original. And Constantine's son, after making several leadership blunders as emperor, incited an angry mob that ended up burning down the first Hagia Sophia. Then Emperor Theodosius built the next megachurch here in 415 AD, making it a little more durable, which was a good thing since another mob ended up burning that one down too. Then a 3rd and final Hagia Sophia was built by Emperor Justinian, who completed a fireproof Hagia Sophia in 537 AD. Now, despite the under new management signs that must have constantly been posted outside, it had always been a Christian cathedral, run by and ruled by Byzantine Christians. But all that changed suddenly.
Christians worshipped in the Hagia Sophia for almost 1,000 years until a sweeping change took place in this part of the world, Islam. The Turks invaded and conquered Constantinople in 1453, but you might expect that history would record that the Hagia Sophia was utterly decimated and razed to the ground by the conquering army, but instead, the Sultan Mehmet at the time decided that the Hagia Sophia was so beautiful, he would convert it into his royal mosque. But before this could become a mosque, some serious redecorating was in order. Rather than trying to just ignore the Christian artwork and mosaics on the walls, they decided to plaster them over. Also, these gigantic wooden Arabic billboards were put up to cover up a lot of the Christian artwork on the walls and on the ceilings. On the exterior of the building, gigantic minarets were put on each corner of the Hagia Sophia.
Interestingly, all these changes may actually have worked to save the Hagia Sophia as a living record of the history of Istanbul. Because it was converted to a mosque, it was spared the wrath of later Muslim invaders who might have destroyed a church. And because the Christian mosaics were plastered over, they were actually preserved for the careful restoration that has gone into them since 1935, the year in which the Hagia Sophia was converted from a mosque to a museum.
Today, the Hagia Sophia is a world-famous museum, a popular tourist destination, and a major source of income for the Turkish government. There's extensive restoration in process. That explains the gigantic scaffolding behind me. They're even pulling down many of the large wooden Arabic shields and chipping away at the plaster, revealing for the first time in hundreds of years the early Christian roots of this cathedral.
These early Christian roots are now being seen in some pretty dazzling displays of religious artwork. And the cool thing is, you can be among the first in 1,000 years to see it. These exquisite mosaics are examples of Byzantine art, a style of imagery rooted here in ancient Byzantium during the 1,000 years that it was the eastern capital of the Roman Empire. Byzantine images, like the one here of Christ, were called icons and have been extremely influential in how Jesus and other prominent images of Christianity have been represented in artwork all over the world. This famous mosaic of Christ in the south gallery of the Hagia Sophia is said to have eyes just slightly too far apart in order to draw attention to them. They also were supposed to simulate the almost eerie effect of Jesus looking back at you.
Interestingly, many scholars and art historians say that this mosaic of Jesus Christ with John the Baptist on the right, Mary Mother of Christ on the left, is the source of all the artistic representations we see of Christ today. But that begs the question, where did this mosaic come from?
That's an interesting question, isn't it? Ever wonder how the tradition of what Jesus looks like got started? Most artistic representations of Christ do look similar, especially the influential Byzantine icons, which date way back to the 6th century. A tradition has to start somewhere, right? Well, here's where the story gets mystifying, and I might add impossible to prove. The Byzantine tradition of Christ's image, many say, came from an ancient burial cloth called the Edessa cloth. This cloth was discovered hidden in the walls of a city named Edessa, about halfway between Constantinople and Jerusalem. Why was this cloth so significant? Because it was thought to have been the very cloth in which Jesus was buried when he was laid in the tomb outside Jerusalem. The cloth had a strange but quite visible imprint of a man's face and body. How it got there, nobody could explain, and it was thought by many to be the image of Jesus himself. The year the Edessa cloth was discovered? 544 AD, just before all the Byzantine images of Christ began to start looking similar. Now, prior to the 6th century, Jesus, and what little artwork we have from that era, was often portrayed more youthful, with short hair and no beard. But suddenly, in the 6th century, all the icons began to portray a bearded Jesus with longer hair, as if there was some original image they were patterned after. The history of the Edessa cloth is sketchy, but historians do know that it resided here in the Hagia Sophia for about 260 years, during which time this mosaic was created. Then in 1204, after a group of crusaders invaded Constantinople, the great church was looted. From there, it's uncertain what the Crusader knights did with it, but it was supposedly taken to Athens and then on to France. But in the year 1357, in a small French town, the first public display of an ancient linen burial shroud is recorded. The shroud bore the mysterious image of a much-wounded, crucified man in burial position, with forensically correct bloodstains. Since that day, that shroud has been studied, scrutinized, chemically examined, and despite the fact that the notoriously uncertain process of carbon dating puts its origin in the Middle Ages, the shroud is thought by millions to be the Edessa cloth. the cloth that spent 2.5 centuries in the Hagia Sophia. Further tests indicate that pollen grains found on it match the regions of Constantinople, Edessa, and Jerusalem. There is even limestone residue unique to Jewish tombs from the 1st century. And interestingly, chemists and art scholars alike are convinced that the shroud is in no way a piece of artwork. Whatever it is, and however the image got onto the linen, is pure mystery. This mysterious burial shroud is now called the Shroud of Turin because of its current location in Turin, Italy, where it has been periodically on display for over a century. And increasing numbers of scholars believe it to be the very Edessa cloth that sat in the Hagia Sophia while this mosaic of Christ was created. So was this mosaic patterned after the Shroud of Turin? Computer overlay analyses have revealed a stunning number of points of congruence between this mosaic and others like it with the shroud. But at the end of the day, it's impossible to really know for sure. The important part for Christians is that when the shroud was discovered, only an imprint and not a body was found with it. When you remember how seemingly insignificant the Christian worldview was during the first few centuries, it's truly an amazing reality that this cathedral and the empire it represents ever existed. Christianity began with a small but faithful band of believers and was, at first, ignored, then scoffed at. Then it became an irritant, then intolerable. Then, like Christ himself, reviled and hated and often harassed and persecuted. But it never died. It only grew. For something to grow so big, so world-changing, and start so small with just a few faithful people, it is really an amazing testimony to something far greater than simply the designs of men.
In the words of the book of Acts, we see the humble beginnings of the Christian church, where men and women would gather together in homes to partake of communion, sing hymns, and to fellowship. Under the persecution of the Roman Empire, those same Christians are driven underground. Not far from here, in the region of Cappadocia, we saw these caves where the Christians would worship for fear of persecution. In a few short years, with the signing of a decree by Roman Emperor Constantine, these Christians could come out of their caves into this, the largest religious structure of its day for 1,000 years. People would come in here and literally think they were walking through the doors of the very kingdom of God.
Christianity had, in many ways, overtaken the Roman Empire, making it the Holy Roman Empire. From there, its influence, its teachings, its ethics, and much of its culture became the bedrock and the trajectory for much of Western civilization. This is not Christian horn-blowing, it is simply historical fact. So what kind of world was created out of the bedrock of Western civilization? It was a world that for 2,000 years has certainly had its ups and downs. So much could be said about the history of Europe, the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, the Protestant Reformation, the Enlightenment. But most agree that as Western civilization spread, the frontier, the cutting edge of where it was all leading, was the New World, America. We'll explore that idea in the next and final episode of Drive Through History.